The woman accused of recruiting and abusing underage girls in Jeffrey Epstein's alleged sex trafficking ring is set to face a judge next week. Ghislaine Maxwell is facing a list of charges, including illegally transporting minors and perjury. The FBI arrested her Thursday in New Hampshire, nearly a year after Epstein took his own life in jail. Maxwell is expected to be arraigned in New York's federal court in the coming days. Victims have accused her of helping Epstein run his suspected sex trafficking scheme by luring girls and sometimes abusing them herself. For more on this, let's bring in human trafficking expert and author Kimberly Mehlman-Orozco. Kimberly, first of all, I think these allegations are so horrific to hear for all of our viewers and everyone paying attention to this case. But sex trafficking in America is a reality. Even before we get into the specifics of Maxwell and Epstein, can you tell us about how widespread this problem is and how people can help?
Not only is it extremely widespread, but traffickers generally enjoy a great amount of impunity in committing their crimes. So it isn't something isolated to the uber rich like Mr. Epstein, but traffickers in general oftentimes aren't caught, they aren't prosecuted, and their convictions do not land them sentences that are equivalent to the severity of their crime. But as far as the prevalence, it's very hard to really say how prevalent it is because of the clandestine nature. It's often extremely underreported, and we don't see as many cases coming through the criminal justice system landing those convictions.
And how can people who are moved to help when they hear about this horrific story do something to contribute?
I think it's imperative for them to lobby their legislators for change that actually helps us protect victims, prevent these crimes, and facilitate the prosecution of offenders. I know that in the United States, there's estimated to be hundreds of thousands of victims, but the number of dedicated beds that we have for survivor shelters and the services that they have available for when they are, if and when they are rescued, is very far and few in between. So if they do have a local organization that provides direct services to survivors, which include, helping them get back on their feet, providing shelter, providing vocational assistance, provide them with legal assistance. I think volunteering with those organizations, donating to those organizations, but also just lobbying for change so that we can prevent these crimes from happening in the first place. And when and if a trafficker is caught, have the tools in place for law enforcement, for prosecutors to land convictions that result in substantial amount of times in prison.
All right, Kimberly, let's go ahead and get into the specifics of this case. Sure. Tell us more about what prosecutors say Maxwell did in Epstein's suspected sex trafficking ring and how they were able to run this alleged operation for so long.
Well, she is not, the allegations say that she was not just a third party, that she was actively involved in facilitating the recruitment, the silence of these victims who eventually became survivors, as well as keeping them sort of complacent and facilitating their victimization over the years. It's not actually out of character for traffickers to use women in particular to facilitate their crimes. This helps give them diffuse responsibility, but it also helps gain the trust of potential victims. One thing that I did want to note, that she also probably had a hand in assessing what the victim would be susceptible to. So we saw actually Jeffrey Epstein's, his recruitment and control tactics change depending on the child or the woman that he was trying to victimize. He was assessing what void they had in their life and making the false promise or the promise to fulfill that void. So if she was coming from a lower socioeconomic area, he was offering money. If she was very well educated and talented, he would appeal to her aspirations. If she had low self-esteem, he was helping build that up by complimenting, her appearance and making her feel beautiful. I think the allegations against Maxwell were not only facilitating the recruitment, but also seeing what would appeal to these different victims, which tactic would get them to be compliant, would get them to be in a position of vulnerability.
So you've already started to tell us a bit about the alleged victims. What more can you tell us about the girls and young women who are survivors?
Well, as I talk about in my book, a victim, a survivor, they can come from any walk of life. They can come from a lower socioeconomic area. They can come from great families and great backgrounds with a lot of opportunities for social mobility. It really just it runs the gamut. They can come from anywhere, but a trafficker is essentially looking for what she has missing in her life and making the false promise to fulfill that need. And so I base the susceptibility off of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And a trafficker is looking for what voids she has in that area. And Mr. Epstein was no different in that regard. He was looking for what he can make a false promise he can to give her to get her into a susceptible position.
Well, we've heard recently from attorney Alan Dershowitz, who's also been accused of taking part in the alleged sex trafficking ring. He wrote a piece Friday asking people to keep an open mind about Maxwell and slammed the recent Netflix documentary about the couple. How can we expect Maxwell's case to play out in court moving forward, and what are the potential implications for Dershowitz?
So in his piece, he was essentially looking at the inconsistencies in the survivor stories and pointing out those inconsistencies as a way to say that perhaps they weren't being truthful in what they were alleging against Maxwell. That is a common tactic that's used in courtrooms across the country when in the prosecution of traffickers. They look for inconsistencies. But what he failed to realize is that, rape trauma syndrome, child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, because of the trauma that these women face, even if they are being inconsistent, even if they omit information or retract it and correct themselves, that is consistent with somebody who's gone through that kind of trauma. It does not in any way create a credibility gap, quote unquote, that cannot be overcome in the courtroom. And so I think that he's sort of setting the stage that of a tactic that Maxwell might use to create a credibility gap in these victims and their allegations of inconsistency. But that will be overcome, I feel, in the courtroom. And I think that it will be interesting to see how it plays out and how much substance is provided to support their claims and really overcome the argument that he makes in that piece.
Kimberly, one last question for you.
Sure.
Will Maxwell's arrest have any impact on civil cases that have already been filed by some of these survivors?
So in civil cases, the standard is we've seen a lot of cases come forth where it's the allegation of the third party. They either knew or they should have known what was going on. So that was the initial allegation against Maxwell, that she knew or she should have known what was going on. And that is what is alleged to her to make her liable in a civil capacity. In a criminal capacity, she needed to be actively involved. And so they have, from the indictment, they have claimed to have met that standard, that she was not only a third party that knew or should have known, but she was an active facilitator in the recruitment, in the control, in the silence, but also directly involved in some of the alleged victimizations that Epstein committed.
All right, Kimberly Mehlman-Orozco, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.